I also pasted a link in the Slack channel, the general one, to JSBin. So we're going to just start off doing some in-browser editor just to kind of learn about classes. Okay, so today what we're going to look at is classes, a little bit more into objects, and then classes all in JavaScript. And so kind of when we looked at JSON, those were basically objects coming from an API, and we were able to kind of render these things and work with properties. And so those are kind of just the basics of objects. But we're going to look a little bit more at them and how do we create objects and classes that make objects. And the reason why it's good to know this is pretty much all programming languages have the concept of a class and objects, and so kind of once you learn JavaScript, then you kind of know the idea in other languages. And most frameworks today, they're kind of based on the idea of objects and classes. And so when we look at Ember next week, you're going to see kind of this class thing. And so if you've never seen a class before, it can be a little confusing. And so that's why I kind of want to dive into it a little bit today. Just like, how does it work? What is a class? What is an object? And then we're going to also look at the Google Maps JavaScript library. Google Maps, the Google Maps JavaScript library is very heavy on classes and objects, so you can actually see like an actual library that makes use of it instead of just like the theoretical examples I'm going to go over first. So to start, we're going to use JSBin. So I kind of posted this link in the Slack channel. And this is just good for if you just want to like tinker around with JavaScript or HTML, CSS. Like if you want to make a bunch of files, it's just kind of nice to have. You can save links, so you can kind of refer back to this later. I use this a lot for debugging. But okay, so to kind of start off, let's kind of start off with objects. So we saw objects in the JSON, right? That we got back from Reddit and GitHub, and those were just objects, and we would just kind of render different properties of these objects. So objects may contain other objects, they may contain strings, numbers, booleans, arrays, and we would just kind of take that and render it onto the screen. So let's kind of go back a little bit and create our own custom objects. So I'm going to start and just kind of create a variable called just my name. And so I'm going to say 2 curly braces. And so this is basically an object. So if I were to do console.log and then that variable, and then in the upper right hand corner, if you click the run button, you can see it's object, and so you can see a little bit of information about it. And then I think if you also open up the console, so if you right click, inspect, and then navigate to console, I'll zoom in a little bit, you can see this here as well. So it's just kind of an empty object. Okay, so let's give, so an object really is just a collection of related variables and functions, which we'll get into. So if we just think about variables for this object, you know, this I might have, we'll say like a first name property. So this would be my name. And so the way we define these in an object is kind of the key, which is on the left. It has to be a kind of a string. It can't start with, there's some rules around it, like it can't start with a number, it can't be special characters. So just the same rules around defining variables kind of apply to keys in objects as well. So we have a key on the left, then a colon, and then the value. And so this value can really be anything, but in this case, I just made a string. So that's kind of just one single, an object with one property. And we can add multiple properties to this by just doing comma-separated key value pairs like this. So I could say, now last name, and so we can just kind of keep on adding more properties to this. So if I were to clear and then hit run again, you can see kind of the contents of the object printed out. So this is just one type of kind of a data structure in JavaScript. So objects, really just think of them as a group of related variables. In this case, the variables would be first name, last name, and school. And instead of calling them variables, they're called properties. So we can kind of add more attributes to this. So I could say like is student colon false. So I can give it a Boolean value. Age, give it a number. You could say like interests. You can make an array of really anything. So it's really just key value pairs, and it's a collection of related variables. Any questions? So one thing to kind of note when you're kind of defining objects like this, don't forget the comma, otherwise you'll get like syntax errors. That is pretty important. The only one that doesn't need the comma is the last key value pair in the object. I think if you can add it and it won't complain, but usually most people leave it off. So if we go back to this console log statement, we can say David dot first name. And if I run it, we're going to use, we can see David being printed out to the screen. So we use dot notation here. And then we can access the properties. So object dot and then the property name. So whatever you kind of, any type of variable that you make, that can be a value inside an object. So really anything that you can make in JavaScript, you can just put as the value here. So we can also give our objects behaviors and what they call functions or methods. So if I want to have, say, a function called get full name, we can say get full name colon function. So this is just like before where we say colon and then the value, but in this case the value is a function. So I could say return, I'll just put a string here. So if I go to the console log statement, I can say David.getFullName and then invoke it with parentheses. So if I run this, you can see this function executed, and this is what was returned. Now this function or method isn't too useful because I'm just kind of reduplicating these values that I kind of already defined. So the way we can actually just take advantage of properties that already exist in the object is using the this keyword. So here we can say this dot first name, and so this will represent the David object in this case. So when the get full name is executed, this is going to refer to the object at hand. So I'm calling get full name on David, so this will refer to David. So I can say this dot first name plus, or let's see, we could say the backticks. You can say like this dot first name space this dot last name. It's really just kind of concatenating these two values together. Yes. Oh, that was just concatenation. So like in newer JavaScript. So we could have also done this where I say this dot first name plus space plus this dot last name like this. It's just like a more terse way of doing it. Yeah, it's like a newer JavaScript feature. So this gets a little bit like harder to read. So I'll usually favor the backticks, but both work. So just kind of one thing to remember when we define objects, that this keyword refers to the object that the function is being called on. So in this case, get full name is being called off of David. So inside get full name, this is referring to David.
Do you need this? Or?
Yeah, like I know in other languages like Java and stuff, you don't have to put it.
Okay.
In JavaScript, you do.
You have to, okay.
Okay, so this is kind of one object here, but what if I want to create other, this right here I'm representing like a person object. It's a person about me, but what if I want to create other person objects and with different properties, but they all kind of share the same behavior, like the get full name function. And so that's when kind of this, isn't as useful, and there's another construct for that we can use, and it's called the class. So the class is kind of like a blueprint, and we can say, hey, here's a bunch of functions, and I'm going to call this class person, and I can create a bunch of David objects or an object for each one of you, because we're all people, and we'll all share the same behavior of get full name. So the way we do this is we can say, I'm going to comment this part out. Is we can say class person and then two curly braces. So this is like a general structure, but this isn't the object itself. I've just said, hey, here's a get person, here's a person class, kind of like, and we're going to start defining different properties to make up the person. Okay, so how do I kind of create an object out of this person class? The way we can do this is we can say, let's say I'm going to do console log first. The way we can do this is we can say let David is equal to new person. And so we're kind of using this new keyword, and in ITP 301 you probably saw it with arrays, right? We said like new array. Array was also a class. Or if you've used dates in JavaScript and you saw like new date, that was dates also a class in JavaScript, and we're kind of creating a date object or an array object. But in this case, we're saying, okay, let's create David. He's a person, so we use this new keyword, and we invoke this class. The class is really just kind of like a function behind the scenes, but we use it by saying new and then the class name. So then I can say console log David, and if I do run, we can see, hey, we have an object now. So I could do multiple things. I could say, we could create another one. So we can create multiple objects off of this same person class. What do I do? Oh, whoops, forgot the G. There we go. Okay, so this is really just an empty class. How do we actually make it a little bit useful so we can say, okay, let's assign different properties to it. So let's do this. When we say new person, we're executing kind of this person class or function, and let's pass it a name. So in this case, I'll say we'll pass it in as a string. So maybe the first argument is my first name, the second is my last name, Okay, so when we call new person, there's a special function in this class that gets executed, and it's called constructor. So it's kind of like a special keyword in there, but if I say it'll receive kind of the first name, and then it will also receive the last name. So I can say console.log first name and last name. Okay, so I'm going to clear and rerun, and we can see both of these things kind of were logged when we invoked it. So whenever we say new person or new and then whatever the class name is, this special function named constructor gets invoked with the arguments that we passed it. So in this case, each of these. So hence we see these values logged to the console. Okay, so what we can actually do is we can say this dot first name is equal to first name, and this dot last name is equal to last name. And so what we're kind of doing here is we're saying let's take these values and assign them as properties with the same name on the object, on the person object that's being created. So in this case, there's a person object being created, and it's going to have properties called first name and last name, and it's going to be set to these values, first name and last name, that were passed into the constructor. So I'll delete this console log here to make the console less noisy, and then rerun. And you can see on the right, each of these objects here, now they have properties called first name and last name, but set to the values that were passed in when we said new and then the class name. So that's what these kind of keys are. we could actually call it something else. So if I wanted to say like this dot first, if I didn't want them to be the same, I could say like this dot first and this dot last. And we ran it. Now you can see that the object has keys first and last. So they don't have to be the same name. It just, in some cases, you might want them to be just called the same thing. Any questions? So in this person class, we're constructing a new object, and that's why kind of this function has that special keyword called constructor, because it's, this is the main function that gets executed when you say new in the class name. It's constructing an object. And we can actually define those functions on this class like we did with this object. So this get full name, we could actually take this and then just copy this over and paste it in here. So I'm going to get rid of the comments that I had. I'll just delete this. So we're defining a function called getFullName. And there's a slight change here. We're going to have to just delete the colon and then the function keyword. So it just becomes getFullName parentheses. So it's like a slightly different syntax. But this is how we define other functions on the class.
How come you have to like explicitly say it's a function when you're just like defining the actual object? Like,
oh, down here?
Yeah, versus.
Oh, this was like the older style. So technically, what you can do in the newer one is also this too.
Oh, okay.
It's just like a newer syntax. I don't think this like older style syntax works with classes.
Oh.
The class was like a new addition. So,
okay.
Yeah. Yes.
Do you not need commas between things in the class?
Oh, but no, you don't.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, the whole like class construct is a relatively new addition. So like the syntax is a little different. Okay, so kind of looking at this get full name, instead of referencing this dot first name, we called it first and last. So I'm going to delete the name part. So we're going to say this dot first and this dot last. And then just like before, on each of these objects, they now have a get full name method. So I can say get full name and execute it. So dot get full name. And so in this case, the this will represent David in this one case, and then the this will represent Rob in this case. Yeah.
So classes are a way of creating JavaScript objects.
Yep.
Right. So when you call a constructor or when you create an object from a class, does that get full name function get copied over each time?
No, it's like behind the scenes. This get full name function there's like only one reference to it, like in memory, and then each one is kind of sharing it. But they change the value of this depending on what you call it on. So like in this case, it's called on David, so it knows, okay, this is pointing to David in this one case, but then the this in this one is pointing to Rob. So it's basically one copy.
Okay.
Yeah. So they kind of make it efficient like that. Oh. Okay, so if we see the console log, we can see first and last name being print out to the screen.
When you call console.log on just David or just Rob,
Mm-hmm.
it calls it like object, and then you use the name of the object. Is there a reason it doesn't call it a person?
Oh, in here?
Yeah.
I think inside this console, let me check on this one to see what happens. Oh yeah, see, we can already see it from previous ones, but here it's saying person.
Yeah.
I think this one, just because it's like a fake console, maybe it's
Okay.
not. Yeah.
Gotcha.
That's actually a good point to point out. So, okay, so let me kind of go back and just delete this. I'll run. Okay, so in this case, I'm saying console log David. So I'm just logging out the object. And what we see in the console is we do see an object, but it has a person next to it. So it's saying, hey, this object is a person object. So we have all kinds of objects in JavaScript, but this one was like a specific kind, which is person. So it came from this person class. Now, if we kind of go in here and I just do the double curlies to create just an object this way, oh, well, it doesn't even have a name. So, yeah, just. So, yeah, you can just, I guess, in the end, they're both objects, and objects all work the same, where you have like dot notation to access things. But in this case, this one is just saying, hey, this one came from person, the person class. Okay, so I just wanted to kind of teach just the high level of it. There's actually a little bit more that JavaScript classes can do. If you're familiar with other programming languages, they have you can extend from other classes. So it's all kind of, you can do that stuff. What it doesn't have is like private and protected yet. So if you have done all that, like in other languages, it's not there. So it's not like the same as in other languages. There's a few differences, but roughly the basic idea is there. So on the this week of list of links, I put a reading for JavaScript constructor functions and classes. Kind of before classes were added to JavaScript, they were called constructor functions because behind the scenes they were just functions, and they look a little bit funny. So just recommend you reading this. Instead of saying like class person, you'll see like function person, and then kind of later on you'll see stuff about you'll see like prototype, and the syntax was just kind of a little ugly and just hard to reason about. So that's part of the reason why they added this like class construct in JavaScript. So I think it's easier to digest when you see this, but if you kind of want to know a little bit more about like what's happening behind the scenes, read this post. But it gets a little, there's some details that you don't necessarily need to know like for a lot of cases. Okay, so I think now we can kind of move on to the Google Maps library, and we can see classes and objects in action. So this is enough just to kind of, use the thing and see like objects in action, and this new keyword not be so mysterious, because at first it can be like, what's going on here. So this is kind of like what's happening behind the scenes in their library. So any questions on this before we leave this? Okay, so go ahead and download these starter files. So I'm going to do that. Okay, so downloaded the files, opened up my editor, and this basically just has an index HTML. I set some default stuff in there that's Google Maps needs. So I put the 3 script tags at the bottom. So the Google Maps library, jQuery, just to make some event stuff a little bit easier, and then an empty main.js file. Google Maps does need this CSS for it to work, just to kind of like size the map correctly. So I just threw that in there. Other than that, that's really all that's going on. Okay, so I'm going to go inside the folder, double click, open it up, open up my console. And hopefully you see this. So you might see a warning here. It's going to say Google Maps JavaScript API needs some API keys. You can look them up, and I kind of went through it a little bit. So originally when I did this a long time ago, they didn't really have, I think finding the API keys was a little bit easier, but then I tried it the other day and I was like, it was kind of hard to find. So it still works without it. You might have, if you got like too many requests, then they might shut it down for you. So it's good enough for us to learn in this class. And then, if you really want to use it for a real site, you just have to hunt down trying to find like where do you get the API keys. But I'm sure I just gave up a little bit too early. Okay, so if you want to go to the index.html file, I'm just going to add one single div, and it's going to have an ID of map. And this corresponds to this CSS, so it just sets a height of 100%. And the map that Google Maps creates is going to be injected into this div. Okay, so we can close the index.html for the most part. And if we go to the main.js file, we can start working with it. So the way we create a new map is we can just define a variable. We'll call it map. And we're going to use that new keyword. So pretty much everything in the Google Maps JavaScript API is an object created by a class. And these classes all start with google.maps. So in this case, we're going to use the google.maps.map class. Okay, so what we pass to the map class's constructor is two things. The first is a reference to the map element. So in this case, in our index.html, we said div id map. Here we can say document.getElement by ID map. So that's the first thing we pass to the map class. And the second is an object. So we just say comma, 2 curlies. And then go ahead and save. And we'll go back to the browser and refresh. Okay, so we do get an error, and it says cannot read property zoom of null. So this actually takes in one property for this second argument that we pass the map class, and it's zoom. So in this case, it's a value, I think, from 1 to 13. So we can do 8. And then refresh. Save it. Oh, wait. Okay, so it takes the zoom, and then I think it also takes the center. So we're going to say, what's the center? And we have to give it some kind of position. And so this position is actually also another object created by a Google Maps class. So we can say new google.maps.lat long. So we give it kind of a latitude and a longitude. And I kind of figured these out just beforehand. So the one for USC is 34.043514, comma, minus 118.266.210. So maybe we just define this as a separate variable. So I'll just say let USC equals this. And we'll say center is USC. A little bit more readable. Okay, so refresh, and we see a map. So these two are kind of like the two properties that are required. I thought zoom was only one, but it turns out you actually do need center. So we got a map. We centered it to USC. We could change the zoom. So if we make it like 3, refresh, it goes out. So maybe we change it to like 10. And so we have a map that covers the whole screen. Any questions? So you can see already, just looking at it, we have two, we're taking advantage of two classes in Google Maps, the lat long to define a latitude and longitude object, and then the map object, which puts the map on the screen. So in this case, this is more like data, whereas this is kind of a little bit more visual because this is actually creating elements on the screen. So if you open up your console, we have access to these variables like USC and map. So if I just type in USC, we can kind of inspect the object, and you can see like there's a method called lat and another method called lng. So I could say like usc.lat, it gives me the 34 value, usc.lng, it gives me the longitude value. Oh, and it also says like, the reason I knew these were functions was because it said colon F parentheses. That's just how Chrome, I think, does it. And if we define, let's see, map. The map object actually has a lot more stuff. So you can see like center, some other stuff. But yeah, not too hard to get kind of a Google map on the screen once you kind of know like, okay, what classes to use and what script tags to add to the page. Okay, so let's say we want to put a marker on the screen. The way we can do this is we can actually use the marker class in Google Maps. So we can say let USC marker is equal to new google.maps.marker. And so this marker constructor takes in an object as its argument. And we have to tell it a few things. We have to tell it, okay, which map do we want to put it on? So in this case, we only have one map, but you could, in theory, have multiple maps on your page. So we just defined one variable called map, so we're going to put it on this map. At what position do we want to put it? So in this case, I want to put it at the USC latitude and longitude. so it knows kind of where to put the marker. And that's really it. So again, this is just another class, and this one is kind of more of a visual object because it adds something to the screen, whereas like lat long was just kind of just data. So if I refresh, we can see that little red marker. If you read through the docs, you can actually change this marker to like your own custom image. So there's a bunch of things you can do with it. One thing I like to do is there's also another property called animation. So you can do google.maps.animation.drop. So this is just kind of like a constant. And so by passing this into the marker, it'll do this like a drop animation. So this is not a constructor or a class. This is just like a constant. So if I go and refresh, you can see that marker just kind of comes down. And so because Google is a variable, a global variable on the page, I could actually just do this and say we can actually get a list of other values in here. So I could see bounce and drop. Not sure why these are labeled a little bit differently, but let's try bounce. Oh, that's kind of cool. Huh. Maybe. I wonder what these other ones do. Maybe hover, is that what it stands for? Huh. Kind of weird that these have like less descriptive names than these, but all right, let's do it. Bounce. Okay, so we got, let's see, 3 classes here: lat long, map, and marker. We can also add info windows to the map, and this is also kind of another class. So we can say let info window is equal to new google.maps.info window. And this also takes an object as its argument. And so you've probably seen those info windows where you can like click on the marker and shows a little thing with some more information about it. So in this case, we want to say, okay, where's the position? Position, we're going to say, let's put it at the USC lat long. And then the content is what goes inside of the info window. So in this case, we could say something like, we can even put HTML in here, and we could say like USC. Okay, so if I refresh, we're not going to see it just yet. So we actually need to call info window, and info window has a method on it called open. So I'm going to open this on this map, so that map variable we created. So if I refresh, you can see it's just kind of like, see the thing like poking out, like bouncing up and down behind it. I wonder if we change this to hover, maybe it goes a little bit above it. Maybe not. There might be another setting that says like put the marker a little bit above it, but I have to look at the docs for that. Okay, so let's say we want to make it so that when we click the marker, we open up the info window. We don't want it to show kind of automatically. So what we can do is use Google Maps. They have like an event system, and it's similar to the one built into native JavaScript. Where does anyone kind of know like has anyone heard of like add event listener? Have you seen that? Okay, so Google's is pretty similar to that. It's google.maps.event.add-listener. And so I want to say, let's add a listener on the USC marker. And I want to listen for a click event on this USC marker. So when I click this, go ahead and run this function. And then I'll just move this line from here and say, let's open it up. Okay, so if I refresh and I click it, you can see it comes up. And I can close it, I can open it, close it. Any questions? Okay, so let's add a little bit more to this. We're gonna add a search form at the top, so we can say we can type in an address. So I'll type in like USC, then it adds the marker to the map, and then we can click on the marker, and it will figure out, okay, let's take those coordinates that it found, and then geocode them and say, okay, what's the likelihood of the address, or what's the first address that matches, what the search was. So so you can just mess around with Google Maps a little bit more. Let's kind of at the top of the screen, let's put a form. So I'm going to say form. Oops. Then I'm going to say input, type text. Oops. And then we'll have a button that says search. And then let's give this text input like, let's give it an ID and we'll say search term. So if I refresh, there we can see the search input here. Okay, so let's kind of, we'll go back to the JavaScript, and we're going to do add an event listener to the form. Let's see, I will do this. I'm going to do this at the top just because, well, let's see. I'll do it at the bottom, I guess. Okay, so on the form, we're going to say on submit. So the submit event on the form. We're going to run a function. And so this is just using jQuery. Let's get the search term. So I'll say let search term is equal to document dot get element by ID search dash term. Oh, whoops, and it should be dot value. Okay, so the goal of this is I'm going to type in something. So I'm going to type in like an actual address, and it's going to figure out where on the map it is and then put a marker there. So I could type in, I don't know, some restaurant, and it finds kind of one and it puts it on the map. So the way you can do this is in Google Maps, there's a another class called the geocoder. So I can say let geocoder equals new google.maps.geocoder. And so geocoding is basically the process of taking like an address and turning it into coordinates, or you can do the opposite and take coordinates and turn it into an address. So off of this geocoder object, there's a method on it called geocode, and it takes in an object, and here we can pass in the address. So there's one property called address, and this address is going to be what we're going to type into the search box. So in this case, it's going to be this search term value. So when it kind of tries to do the search and translate our address into actual coordinates, it's going to take a little bit of time. And so this is also asynchronous, kind of like AJAX and set timeout that we learned about previously. And so what we pass to geocode is a function as a second argument, and it's going to execute this function when those results come back. So it's a little bit different than the promises we learned about with AJAX. They chose not to use promises. Instead, they said, let's just pass in a function, a callback, what they call it, a callback function, and they'll execute this function when the results come back. So this function will receive the geocoder results. And I can just do a console log on geocoder results. Okay, so go back to the app, refresh, and I'll search for something. Let's see. Okay, Griffith Observatory. I'm gonna hit search. Oh, okay. So anyone see kind of what went wrong?
You have to do prevent default.
Yeah. So if I hit search, it kind of does a full page reload, so you can see it. And so I'm kind of wiping out the page. So we're gonna see. Okay, so we're gonna pass in the event for the jQuery, and we'll say event.prevent default. So prevent the default behavior of the form submission. We don't want that page refresh. We want to intercept that and just handle it all in JavaScript. Okay, refresh. And let's try this again. Okay, so if I do the search, we can see that the results were logged to the console. And let's see. Okay, so what we get back is an array, and so it gives us multiple things. In this case, there's only one Griffith observatory, so there's only one result. So we're just going to pick off the first one, but if we did something else, okay, veggie grill. I do a search. We open up the array. Seven. Oh, they might be inside address components. No, this would be like. Maybe it only gives back one result. Let's see, I'll try school. Yeah, maybe it only gives back one. I'm not sure. Maybe if you supply the API key, it gives more. I'm not. Yeah. Anyways, we can just take kind of the first result, and then if we look inside of it and we look at geometry, you're going to see that this geometry object has a location, and so this location is the lat long. So that same kind of lat long object that we created manually for USC, we can take that and say, okay, let's make a marker for this lat long. So what we can do is in here, we're going to say let position is equal to geocoder results. We'll grab the first one, or really the only one, but the first 0 index dot geometry dot location. And it might be useful just to kind of recenter the map based off of this location. So we could say map, and there's a method on the map object called set center, and we're going to set the center of it to this new position. So this kind of takes a latitude and longitude object, which is this, and so we'll just recenter the map. No, I'll leave this up for a sec. And so all this stuff, like which properties define, this is all in the Google Maps JavaScript documentation. So, okay, so let's try this again. Okay, so we saw the map shift a little bit. If we change the zoom on the map, so let's make it 4. Oh wait, that was the other way. Okay, so I made it 13. So it's kind of zoomed in a little bit more. Let's do another search. Okay, so now you can see it kind of reshifted, and it was a little bit more obvious. So we took the address from the search box, we geocoded it to turn it into kind of a latitude and longitude, and then we took that latitude and longitude, picked it out of the results, and then just said, hey map, recenter yourself to that location. So we can even put a marker there. We could say, let's create a new marker. So we'll say new Google dot, well, let's just copy it from above. We'll just take the same marker and paste it. And we don't really need kind of this variable name because we're just saying, okay, let's just create a new marker on this map. And the position, instead of it being USC, we'll say position. And let's change it to like drop. we're kind of mixing just kind of regular JavaScript form submission jQuery stuff with Google Maps so that we can, construct kind of like what happens when you visit, Google maps.google.com. So I go back and refresh, and then I do a search. Oops. Okay, so reposition the map. We saw the point drop. And if I zoom out, we can see that USC still has the bouncing marker. So every time we search, we'll just keep adding things. Any questions? Yes.
I didn't really get the last part where when you searched it, it like would connect. Could you just go over that?
Which piece? Like here?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So when we submit the form, we grab the value out of the search box. So whatever we typed is search term. And then this geocoder.geocode, we're saying, okay, let's take whatever we typed in, which is like Malibu, and turn it into a set of latitude and longitude. And so when we call geocode, we pass it that search term, and then this function gets executed when the results come back. And so that latitude and longitude, based on this search term, is kind of located in geocoder results, which is this variable. So it kind of contains it kind of deep in there, which you just have to hunt for. And well, the documentation actually says it, but yeah. And then, so this is kind of the latitude and longitude. And I'm saying, okay, set the center of the map. I just want to reposition. So set it to this new latitude and longitude. And then also create a new marker for this map at this new position, which is this piece. And then I just kind of added the animation here. Yeah. Yeah, so the geocoding is the process of kind of taking the address and turning it into coordinates. And they call reverse geocoding the opposite, which is like taking the coordinates and trying to come up with an address.
And how would we remove the marker? Like, if we only wanted like one marker at a time?
The markers actually have, I think, like a remove method. So if I did, let's do USC.
USC marker dot like remove.
Yeah. Maybe it's on the map.
Visible.
Visible true. I'm pretty sure there's a method that does this. Just trying to look through the history. Let's see. Maybe it's on the map. Let's see. Let's try this. Probably have to look at the docs.
Okay.
But they're probably, I mean, I know there is. I don't remember what it is off the top of my head.
So then in that case, we'd have to like store like the new marker and then just delete it.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah. Let's see. Google Maps, remove marker. Oh,
Oh, I don't.
markers.setMap null. Okay, so that's like not the most intuitive thing,
Okay.
but it looks like if you say USC marker.setMap null,
Oh, okay.
probably should have called it remove marker, but any other questions? So the main takeaway today was just kind of exposing you to classes which create objects and then using those classes. So we just saw kind of like the person example. So if you have to create a class, that's how you do it. And when we look at Ember, we basically, Ember comes with a bunch of generators and things that kind of create the class, but then we just have to fill in the class. And we don't really have to do the new part as much. They kind of do it behind the scenes, but it's just good knowing like, okay, take this class and then we create objects from this class using this new keyword. And then Google Maps made a lot of use out of it to expose the map functionality. And okay, so I put 2 articles here. They were just kind of like, some of it's a little bit of what I did today. There's some extra things in there that you might find. So one's on the Google Maps stuff, and the other's on just classes and constructor functions. You don't really have to, like if you're not planning on being a dev or anything, you don't really have to read a good chunk of this stuff because it gets a little nitty gritty. But if you do, it's probably good to read just because, you know, it comes up. Okay, so for the assignment, okay, so you're going to build a little app that locates your current position. So when the page loads, you're going to use the built-in geolocation API that's in the browser to find your current coordinates. And so there's just like one function you call to say, hey, what are my coordinates right now? And so you'll take those coordinates and then plot them on a map with a little marker and like an info window. And when you click on the marker, you'll say, okay, what's the address of this location? So the browser will tell you here are your coordinates, and then you're gonna use Google Maps to put a marker there. And so when you click on it, show what's the likely address for that location, kind of using the geocoding. And then here's like a little extra challenge. So hunting through the Google Maps documentation and swap out the little red marker for a custom image. So how do you find kind of your current coordinates? I put it inside the reading, so under here, geolocation. And if you scroll to, let's see, the bottom, I think. Okay, so here's the function. You say navigator.geolocation.getCurrentPosition. So this is built into the browser, and you pass it a success function, an error function, and some options potentially. In this case, there's none, but you can give it like, let's see. Oh, here are the options. Okay, you could say like, how accurate do you want to be, timeout, and maximum age. So we can actually just run this right now. So if I were to do, I'll just open the console here. Whoops. Okay, so navigator.geolocation.getCurrentPosition, and we'll take in a success callback. And I'll say console.log result. So if I do this, you're going to see a little thing pop up right here. It's going to say, do you want to allow this site to access your current location? If you block it, you're not going to get anything. But if you say allow, There we go. You can see here's the position. So there's a type of position, kind of like that person we did, and we saw like person and the object. This is probably like a position class. But we can see here's some coordinates. And so now that we have coordinates, we can take that and say, hey, Google Maps, what's the likely address for this? And it'll tell you. So we'll kind of create a little app that just shows, okay, where am I? And it'll kind of tell you where you are. So also in this post, let's see. So you're going to use get current position to kind of find your current coordinates. There's also, where is it? Oh, there's also watch position. So if you want to have like an app that's always updating based on like as your phone's moving or your device is moving, you can constantly get updated with those coordinates. So things like Uber and stuff, like you could make a web version of it. And then the other piece is, so in the example that we did today, we took the actual address and turned it into coordinates. So that process was geocoding. You're basically, in this assignment, you're doing the opposite. You're saying, here's some coordinates, I want to turn it into an address. And so that's called reverse geocoding. And that's also in this post, which, let's see. Here we go. Kind of reverse geocoding. It's the same function called geocode, but you just pass it, instead of address, you pass location, and it's your coordinates. So you're going to create like a location object and pass it there. Any questions? No? Cool. All right, so next week we'll dive into Ember. So we'll kind of start working with frameworks.